we'll do the live thing first. Like. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time listening, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always say, feel free to reach out to the podcast either on our Twitter or our Instagram. Hit us up on our DMs there at the Bigmark podcast, at the Bigmark pod. You can rate the podcast, hit that bell for notifications if you're watching on YouTube, and check out our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpodcast. You can support the podcast in any way. There's different tiers there, all kinds of fun stuff like that. Today on today's episode, I kind of wanted to just jump right into it. On last week's episode, if you're listening for the first time, I was talking about Succession, which is a tremendous show. And I was talking a lot about Jeremy Strong, who plays Kendall on the show, Kendall Roy, and he is a method actor. And I mentioned this documentary when I was talking about Jeremy's performance, and it was really interesting. I kind of was wondering what should I do off that? Should I springboard off that idea? Should I just go right into it? I mentioned the Andy and Jim or the Jim and Andy documentary, which is about Jim Carrey playing Andy Kaufman, and he kind of went super method for that. And like I said, I watched the documentary, and it really, I kind of forgot how far Jim Carrey really went into the role, and it's really interesting that the way things kind of shake out with the role, it's potentially the reason why, if you look back at it around, mid 2000s or later, Jim Carrey really started changing and doing different roles, but his public persona was changing, and then kind of later in the 2010s he started, it was almost like he was on a spiritual journey. And I think what conspired during the filming of this movie, which is basically what the documentary goes over, it really sheds a light on kind of why Jim Carrey is the way he is. And it's an interesting documentary, and it's as much as it is about Andy Kaufman, who's a tremendous entertainer. It is a lot about Jim Carrey, which is fascinating, and I suggest everyone watch it. Of course, if you haven't watched it, there's going to be spoilers. But if you like watching the podcast, obviously, I kind of when I try to go over these movies and TV shows and stuff, I try not to ruin the shows. I try to just talk about the highlights. In doing so, sometimes you end up having spoilers here and there, but like I said, I'm throwing it out there. The movie's 5 years old now, so go check it out. Anyway, let's jump right into it. So, the movie's called Jim and Andy, The Great Beyond, but the full title is Jim and Andy, The Great Beyond, featuring a very special contractually obligated mention of Tony Clifton. I'll get into who Tony Clifton is in a little bit. So anyway, Jim and Andy is a 2017 film by Chris Smith, and the film follows Jim Carrey as he remains in character as Andy Kaufman during the production of the 1999 film Man on the Moon, directed by Milos Forman, who also did One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And the movie's tremendous. If you've never seen Man on the Moon, it's almost like I did that. I talked about Another Day, Another Time, which is a great documentary. It's interesting talking about documentaries, especially concert films, but it was interesting having that documentary kind of pair with Inside Llewyn Davis. And this is another instance of that, where this documentary pairs really well with Man on the Moon. So whether you want to watch, although with this one, it doesn't really matter when you watch Man on the Moon. You can watch it first, you can watch it after. But again, the basic idea is that in making Jim and Andy, and making Man on the Moon, I should say, Jim Carrey was so committed to the role that like Andy, he had difficulty separating himself from the character so much that people who knew Andy even family and others close to him actually felt like they had Andy back with them again. So Jim obviously truly embodied who Andy Kaufman was in this movie. It's very interesting. Again, I'll go into it as the podcast goes on, but who Andy Kaufman is, who Jim Carrey is, all these things are very closely intertwined, and it's very fascinating how things, do kind of collide in this universe, and it's really interesting because the documentary itself actually opens with the director asking Jim, how would you start the movie? And Jim says, well, if I had my choice, it wouldn't start at all. It would have already have been, and it wouldn't end either. So again, you can kind of see where Jim's at. This was 2017 when this documentary was done. So the documentary kind of weaves in contemporary 2017 conversations, and then stuff from basically a behind the scenes footage shot by Andy Kaufman's ex-girlfriend, or his girlfriend at the time. I shouldn't say ex-girlfriend, but his girlfriend at the time. She actually shot a lot of behind the scenes footage of Jim on set, and a lot of the stuff was actually held back in Jim Carrey's office for 20 years, and more or less the production company didn't want to release it because they didn't want to make Jim look like an asshole. So, it's a really interesting film, and just again, it is focused a lot on kind of shedding light on Jim Carrey and who he is, which is very interesting. But in the documentary, Jim talks about when he actually heard that he got the role as Andy Kaufman, and he had to audition for it. He had to try for it. It wasn't like he was just chosen to do it. Jim said he was sitting on a beach, and he said, he was looking out in the water, and that's when Andy showed up, tapped him on the shoulder, and said, "Sit down, I'll be doing my movie." What happened after was out of his control. So, again, essentially, Jim allowed himself to be taken over more or less by the character of Andy Kaufman. And whether that means that's what method acting is you just let yourself be taken over. There's something to be said about if creativity or whatever lies above us, kind of in a cosmic dimension or whatever, and whatever way the artist gets it, they're a channel, whether the guitar player or painter or sculptor, they're channeling something from that realm. And if that's what method actors do, essentially that's potentially what Jim is explaining. He's just saying it in a different way. But there might be more layers to it. Jim Carrey's always kind of been in touch with his spirituality, so to speak. He's the guy who wrote himself a $10 million check and more or less manifested it, and he had 3 of the biggest movies of all time in the same year and made $10 million, and it was real. He was on Oprah talking about how he kind of manifested it. He said when he was in grade 2, he had a substitute teacher say, whenever I want something, I pray to the Virgin Mary, and I ask her for it, and I promise something in return, and I get whatever I want. So, very interesting. I mean, coming from a teacher, especially a substitute teacher who's just transient, comes out of nowhere. I think, it's interesting. He's always had these ideas of you can kind of make life you want. And that's really interesting. And it's it's not like there isn't hard work associated with that. And that's the thing, that it's always tough taking these quotes kind of out of context. And you're just like, yeah, I just manifested that $10 million. He worked his ass off and thought about things and worked to get that $10 million. But he had that goal in his head. And I think that's so important, is that so many people go day to day not necessarily having a goal in mind at the end or some type of aspiration to get to. And I think that's why it's hard to believe for some people that, oh, this just happened overnight kind of thing. But it doesn't. It happens with, lots of hard work. And he even said he did it with a bike. Jim Carrey said he manifested a bike. Like, his family could never afford him getting like a sweet bike, and he did that whole thing. He promised that he'd do the rosary, and he got a bike. It's, so again, he had these experiences in life that did reinforce that fact that if you really hope, and who knows what happened with that bike thing too, right? Like, whether or not we can explain it with logic, like maybe his dad overheard him praying or hoping, or he said it sometime or asked for it at some point, and then somehow they scrounged up the money and made it happen. Either way, Jim got the bike. So very interesting. And when Jim was a young comedian, he said he would stay up at night and kind of ask himself, what would people want? What would people want? And then one night he kind of bolted up in the middle of the night and he said, people want to be free from concern. And I always thought that that's such a fascinating idea, is that that's so true, is that people don't want to have to worry about things anymore, and Jim said he became the person, or at least appeared to be the person, free of concern. And, if you can, whether you're an artist or just in your day-to-day life or whatever it is, if you can live with that mind free of concern, getting to that point, showing that there isn't, not worrying, and if there's some form of ideal to manifest, it's this ideal of being free of concern. And Jim said he had his Hyde, like he was Jekyll and Hyde, but he had this good Hyde. It was a positive Hyde and loving Hyde inside him that would come out in front of others. And because he kind of created this persona around himself, somewhat as a protection and a coping mechanism, sure, a security blanket of some type. When you put on that mask, if you want to call it that, it's sometimes hard to remember if you still have it on or when you have it on, right? And Jim says in the documentary, he sometimes thinks afterwards, after being in front of people or after someone hands him the microphone, he goes, damn, I lost control to him. And, I guess that's that Hyde inside of him. But already, Jim Carrey, you can tell he has these partitions in his mind, or anything you want to call it, where there's actually different personalities or characters already in his head, just again to kind of create those layers. He talks about that. What is that little piece of dirt that the pearl forms around, and that your personality is that pearl, and what is that little piece of dirt, that little pain, that little hurt, that little whatever. And Jim Carrey was always talking about that's how he got love, was through entertainment. That's how he thought that's what you were supposed to do. You're supposed to make people laugh, and that's what he did. So again, like I said, Jim's always been open to that idea of the ego or being overtaken by something, whether that is the ego, whatever you want to call it. That's something that he's used to. And I think during this, I think I've talked about it openly enough on this podcast. I'm not a big ghost guy. I love I love the spiritual in the philosophical way, and obviously with psychedelics, I've had those experiences in those realms and stuff, but I've always kind of felt, that the realm of ghosts or whatever, if it's spirits, or if your spirit does kind of like continue on, it's not really gonna like stick around this realm unless it's I guess it's like has a reason to stick around. And I think a lot of like ghost people will say like, oh, they're stuck in this realm, or they have unfinished business, or there's something going on like that's keeping them stuck here. And I feel like maybe there's a reason for them to come back frequently, but I don't know. I've always thought, like, why would they ever stick around here when you can kind of like explore vast plains and go and see and do whatever it is, and maybe there's reincarnation, and then the spirit just gets recycled. So what are we doing here? But this whole thing with Andy and Jim Carrey, it's really hard not to think that Jim was more or less possessed by Andy's ghost. I don't know how else to say it. At certain points, Andy Kaufman's family comes around, and they want to be around Jim, and it's not like Jim Carrey ever met Andy Kaufman. Andy Kaufman died in 1984. So, but somehow Jim Carrey just found a way to completely embody him, and there's many times where Jim talks about Andy in the third person, and even though it was him playing him, it's something to behold. You have to really watch the documentary to truly understand what happened. And the movie's fantastic too. But for those of you who know Andy Kaufman, you kind of know where I'm coming from already. For those of you who don't know, you might not know who the fuck I'm talking about and what the hell's happening. So a little bit about Andy Kaufman. He was born January 17th, 1949, and he died May 16th, 1984. He was an American actor, singer, professional wrestler, and a performance artist. Now notice I didn't say comedian in there. Now it's really interesting. He's probably considered a comedian. I think he's got a signature on the Comedy Store signature fucking line thing, whatever, the wall. But he never really considered himself a comedian. He considered himself a song and dance man. And essentially he is the anti-comedian. He's from New York. He was born there. He's coming out of there. And there's so many comedians in that classic, just stand up, tell jokes. Comedian is so prevalent in New York City, especially at the time, in the 70s kind of thing, late 60s, where Andy was really doing. He kind of came from that beat generation. So it was all about doing things in a different way. And Andy once said, "I'm not a comic. I've never told a joke. The comedian's promise is that he'll go out there and make you laugh with him. My only promise is that I will try to entertain you as best as I can." So again, he's an entertainer. And, that's almost like, I speak about Bill Hicks a lot about on this podcast. And it's almost in that same vein where it's not necessarily funny, ha-ha, but it's funny in like a chaotic way. It's funny in kind of anti, like an anarchist way almost. It's kind of, but most of the time Andy Kaufman just kind of pissed people off, which is really funny. And he gained initial fame on SNL, which is probably why I guess a lot of people probably think he's more of a comedian. And Andy actually became the self-proclaimed intergender wrestling champion of the world. He would wrestle women all the time, and he offered $1,000 to any woman who could pin him. Which, essentially, if you want to look at it from wrestling, which is funny because he actually had a beef with Jerry the King Lawler in real life, and it's funny how, it's almost like Andy really embodied that whole idea of professional wrestling and the heel character, just someone who's just there to stir the pot and, continue the storyline, but just, by being a fucking prick. And, he kind of brought that into real life, and he did it with Jerry the King Lawler. And apparently in real life, according to Jerry Lawler himself, Andy and him, behind the scenes, everything was cool. It was more of a bit, but in the documentary, Jim as Andy actually takes things a little too far, and it actually gets physical with Jerry. Actually, during the documentary, during the filming, of Man on the Moon, and then in the documentary, Jim as Andy eggs on Jerry Lawler. Just just brutal, just heel stuff. Again, it's like it's real life, but Jim as Andy, you know, making decisions as someone else, and whether he was generally possessed or just in that method, you have to make these decisions as a person, as an actor, as whatever, that you're going to go, well, how far am I going to take this? And at one point, Jerry Lawler actually does kind of attacks Jim Carrey. So it's not 100% if they completely plan this, but Jim really plays up the injury, kind of really pretends like he hurts his neck, and it ended up on the real news, and it was actually very Kaufman-esque. So it was almost like, you know, again, that's why it's so strange. It's almost like Andy's spirit was around the film, and I'm sure he would have loved that it made the real news. And it's just a fascinating thing. You know, there's times where Jim Carrey is interacting with other actors on the set, and they're he's yelling at his co-star who's playing his father like it's his real father, and the makeup artist is crying because it's just like it became so much bigger than the actual film. And what they caught on tape is beautiful, but it almost like it just became so much bigger. And again, in that same line, you know, one of the things that Andy Kaufman, he had a character called Tony Clifton, and it was this brutal, just like absolute asshole kind of like lounge singer character, and he was womanized and just brutal and would make fun of people. And the whole bit was that Andy was not him, that they were two different people. And at one point, Bob Zamuda, who was Andy's manager, would actually dress up as Tony Clifton, and they would both appear at the same time just to throw people off. Again, everything was just to throw people off. It was almost like it was like an early punked / early Jackass / early fucking gag show where no one knows that they're on it. It's not even a fucking hidden camera show. It's just, and that's just Andy playing in this world, and it's just it's so interesting. You know, when Jim was kind of explaining you know, that whole shtick, and you know, Andy being such a heel and everyone hating on him, what's that all about? And Jim kind of said, it's like when Jesus said, eat my body and drink my blood. It's way out there. Who knows if he actually meant that, or how much symbolism is behind it, right? You know, it's a way to kind of weed out the crowd. A lot of people are going to go, that's fucking nuts. I'm out. I have no idea what that means. I don't even want to know. But then there's some people who actually do get it and love it, and they see through all of it. But, you know, the people who didn't get it, it seemed like Andy used his style of entertainment to weed out the crowd, and he thrived off the people who actually didn't get it. So, and then that would just make the people who did get more entertained, I'm assuming. So if you got it and if you understood, but the thing is, Andy was the guy who would always just push the joke too far. So probably at the end of the day, he had the last laugh in a way, and God bless. And, you know, Jim says too, you know, when you create yourself to make it, you're going to have to either let that creation go and take a chance on being loved or hated for who you really are, or you're going to have to kill who you really are and fall into your grave grasping on to a character that you never were. And I think that's really interesting. You know, it's a really interesting take on the ego and, you know, the mask, and that whole idea that, you know, at some point we might need to shed this whole idea of who we are, and there might be ways that we're living our life that isn't congruent with really how we feel. And, you know, you talk about the world we live in today, and we've been having to do a lot of stuff that no one wants to do, and been forced into certain situations. And, you know, I think a lot of times your ego is there to protect you and guide you through this world, but sometimes we get convinced by the ego that really is us. And, you know, the Japanese say you have three faces. the first face you show to the world, the second face you show to your close friends and your family, and the third face you never show anyone. And I think that really speaks to this whole idea that we do already have layers to our personality and there's layers to our character. And I think that actors that do this whole method thing are able to kind of potentially bust into those layers. And, at times during the documentary, Jim actually reveals some really intimate truths about himself while he's actually in character. Whether he's dressed up as Tony or whether he's dressed up as Andy, he's talking about himself, Jim, saying, he's a coward. And Jim says he has dreams as Andy and Tony. And, it's an interesting look at the method approach. And it's this idea that he can kind of separate himself from himself. And really, kind of look at himself. There are techniques like that in psychology, role-playing techniques, where you can kind of allow someone to, take another viewpoint. But it really, really seems like he kind of, I don't know if he dissolved his ego. Again, it's very, very interesting to think that, right? Where, someone can kind of forget who they are because they become this character. And, probably over the filming is a year, maybe they were filming the movie, but who knows? Fascinating. Again, this whole idea about if Andy was, or if Jim was actually possessed by Andy, they don't really talk about that so much like as truly possession. It's more so he really embodied the spirit, and it was just kind of amazing acting as well. But if there really is kind of truth to that, and if, as much as I say these spirits are free to leave, I put this story together because I was listening to this random podcast, The Church of What's Happening Now. Shout out Uncle Joey, shout out Joey Diaz. Actually had Bobby Lee on, great comedian. Shout out Bobby Lee, shout out Mad TV. And Bobby Lee was telling ghost stories, in fact, about the Comedy Store, because apparently the Comedy Store in LA, really famous comedy club. Actually, Jim Carrey was a regular performer there. Same with Andy Kaufman. And apparently it's extremely haunted. So it used to be a nightclub for Bugsy Siegel, who was a really famous gangster, and there was lots of murders there, blah, blah, blah. So apparently it's extremely haunted. People have seen ghosts there. People have seen all kinds of weird, freaky shit happening. And one of Bobby Lee's stories is one night at 2 a.m. I don't know exactly when this is. I want to say this was in the 90s. I don't know. I want to say this was in the 90s. But anyway, one night at 2 a.m., in the belly room, which is an upstairs room in the Comedy Store, Bobby saw 15 people in robes, and they told him, you're not supposed to go into this room. Don't go up there, whatever you do. Of course he goes up there and he sees 15 people with robes and purple cloaks, and they're all chanting. And he said when they came out, it was like a bunch of people, and it was Lily Tomlin and Bob's Muda, and they were seancing Andy Kaufman's ghost. So they were actually trying to bring him back. I don't know if that's something that Andy talked about when he was alive that he wanted done. But, if they brought him, if they were trying to bring his spirit back, and when it worked or whatever happened, and all of a sudden this aligns with this whole Jim Carrey thing, and very creepy. Again, it's just interesting because like the family, like Andy's family was involved. It wasn't just like, it was other people who, I kind of knew Andy, and it was like, people were like, Jim Carrey became Andy Kaufman, man. And it's like he somehow let go of that character who is Jim Carrey, like he was talking about letting go. Because I think as Jim Carrey came out of character, he started to realize that he was playing that character himself. He says at one point, I think sometimes people that exist so completely in their character and maybe not know how to get out of it or take another road, take the ultimate road where they have to actually leave the planet. So I don't know if he's talking about you got to kill yourself, like for real. it's a heavy quote, but the idea I think behind it more is that you have to, it goes back to that quote. He says you either have to let go of that character and just hope that people take you for what you are, or that character is going to drag you down and you're going to have to take it to the grave. And I think what he's saying there too is that he did finally he kind of did find another road. I think that's the most important part. It's about finding that road. It's about kind of coming back and integrating. And it is almost like Jim kind of experienced like a psychedelic trip here, an extended psychedelic trip. And again, coming back and integrating everything you've learned is so important. And Jim says, I truly feel like if you ask me, where the real me is, I would say there's a quiet, gentle seat in the universe that seems to contain everything. And that's where he is. So again, he basically says he doesn't want anything, and he has no ambition. And, obviously you can kind of look at that. Is that insane or is that enlightened? Did he really experience that ego dissolution and come back and say, and he's in a different position. Obviously he's a millionaire. He's got lots of money. So, I always used to say, or I still say, you can devote yourself completely to the mind. You can devote yourself to the inner spirit and the workings of what happens in there, because it's infinite. You can always find something, and you can always get better at, whether it's meditation or just understanding the human existence. But you can't live like a normal day job, because it's just going to take you out of this realm that is human constructed. Business and banks and jobs and time, all this stuff, they're all human constructs, and you have to kind of get out of that to really understand what's going on in the universe, I think. And we've gotten away from that as a whole. And I think when people do this, we like to label them as insane, and we like to say that they're crazy, and that's not good. And when you do experience something like this, and you do have that ego dissolution, there is a period where you have to kind of put the pieces back together. And again, if Jim said, listen, I don't want to put the pieces back together, I want to see what I'm left with, maybe that's the Jim Carrey we have today. And, Jim actually said the transition started to happen when he had all the success and everything he ever dreamed of, and he still was unhappy. So it's really interesting, Tom Shadyac, who actually, directed Bruce Almighty and Ace Ventura and all those movies with Jim in it. He actually experienced something very similar, where you have everything in the big house and all the success and all the fame and the awards, and you're still unhappy. And again, it's because sometimes people do sell, there's that old trope and that old idea, cliche, whatever you want to call it, of selling your soul to the devil to make it. And I think that's what this talks about, right? Is that you play this character, you sell off who you really are, you at least put that away, and you present something completely different to the world. And I think that Jim Carrey says depression is your avatar telling you it's tired of playing the character you're trying to play. And it seems like Jim was able to kind of step outside himself. And, when he came back to life, he was able to see all the things that he was that was kind of holding him down. He kind of looked beyond the veil and stepped outside the cave, and now he's kind of in a new phase of existence. And again, I think it's hard. I mean, it's hard to put this on these enlightened people. It's because they're just one of us too, but it's really hard to come back and kind of share what you've learned. And that's like that Bill Hicks quote, it's just a ride. And the people who come back and tell us that it's just a ride and reassure us everything's going to be okay, we end up killing those people because we just don't understand, and it's going to upset things so much. Again, like I said, you can't, even with some of the things that I've learned in cursory psychedelic trips that weren't guided or anything like that, I've had to come back and think of how can I possibly reintegrate this into life. And there's still things that I can't tell everyone that everyone's just going to understand. And there's probably things I've said on this podcast that it just doesn't make sense. But it's one of those things that artists and anyone really who is trying to portray, be creative and express themselves, that expression comes through that channeling from whatever realm you want to call that. And if that's the realm that you enter during psychedelics, coming back from that is art. Whatever you can bring and whatever you can say is a form of art. And I think each style of art, every bit plays that part in, whether it's music, whether it's sculpture, whether it's visual art, whether it's literature, whether it's whatever. Each one of them is a facet of telling that same story of what is beyond, and what is beyond just this realm that we see with our own eyes, because we all know that there's more. If you don't think about it, look deep in your heart, there's more to this. There's more. There's stuff happening right in front of us. Science even tells us there's all these different dimensions. Time is a dimension. There's like 13 known dimensions. We only see such a small sliver of the visual scale. And there's UV, and there's gamma, and there's X-rays, and there's all this different stuff happening right in front of our faces. And different animals on the planet can see it and sense it in a different way. And we think we're the best. Who knows? Maybe they have more to tell us too, but that we just can't listen. We can't hear. We can't communicate with them. And the problem is, this stuff sounds fucking crazy. And people want to dismiss it. And it's like Dave Chappelle said, saying someone's crazy is dismissive. And we can't dismiss the crazy ones. You know, look at Kanye. You know, he's on one, but he might be on a new level. He might be off his meds, but he might be on a new level. And, you know, he's kind of going up against potentially the most mainstream person ever, Kim Kardashian, right? And it's just nothing against that. That has to exist. We need the yin to the yang, but that's it. Those are very extremes clashing, and as humans, we're witnessing that. If we're all one, we're all part of this. Not all just part of Kim and Kanye's. I mean, we're all part of this existence in the universe. And, you know, there's people out there like Jim Carrey, man, that have seen it. And he did it through acting, which is amazing. And, you know, it doesn't have to be psychedelic drugs, doesn't have to be float tanks, doesn't have to be meditation. What you do in life can give you that epiphany and show you what you want. And again, listen to Jim Carrey. People want to have, you know, people want to feel free of concern. That's the most important thing. So again, thank you so much for listening. You know, go out, check this movie out, check out Jim Carrey's stuff. Listen to what he says, you know, don't just dismiss him. I know he's going to be out there doing weird ass shit, but he's going to say some stuff, read between the lines. You know, he's not necessarily with us at all times anymore, people. But he's probably got some important things to say. Thanks again. Like I said, if you ever have any questions or comments or anything you want to say, please hit me up. Instagram at the Bigmark Podcast, Twitter at the Bigmark Pod. Donate to our Patreon, patreon.com/the Bigmark Podcast. Thank you so much to all of our Patreons out there, our patrons, whatever. Anyway, and hit the bell, get the notifications if you're watching on YouTube. Make sure you're getting all the new videos. And everyone take care of yourself. I love you all. Peace. Take it easy. And thank you very much. Peace.